All summer, a group of experts and former military leaders have been playing war. They've been considering what would happen if the United States responded to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Mark Cancian is a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is hosting the Games. Mark, welcome.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So you've said this, quote, under most, though not all, scenarios, Taiwan can repel an invasion. Before we talk about what that would cost each side, what are the scenarios that Taiwan would not be able to repel that Chinese invasion?
The scenarios where Taiwan could not repel an invasion are really very pessimistic. We have what we call a base case, and in that case, the U.S., China, or U.S., Taiwan, and usually Japan can repel an invasion pretty handily, although again at pretty high cost. And even in pessimistic cases, they're able to repel an invasion, although the cost gets increasingly high. In the most pessimistic cases, the U.S. is late, for example, to respond, waiting maybe a week or two. Then the Taiwanese have a much more difficult time.
The costs to Taiwan and the U.S. would be huge. Spell those out for us.
In most of the iterations, the United States loses about 500 aircraft. In the most pessimistic ones, that goes up to about 900 aircraft. Often we lose 2 carriers, maybe 20 to 30 surface combatants, but are able to maintain Taiwan as an autonomous entity. So we succeed, but at extremely high cost.
You're saying up to 900 U.S. aircraft loss. Why? Why so many? What would be happening at that time?
The challenge is that the United States has to move its aircraft forward into places like Okinawa before it's established maritime and air dominance. In the past, in the last generation, we've been able to do that against adversaries and be able to do it relatively quickly. Against the Chinese, it takes a lot of time. But we have to move forward in order to strike the Chinese fleet before the Chinese can establish themselves on Taiwan. So that means that these aircraft are operating forward, they're inside the Chinese missile envelope, and the Chinese missiles repeatedly attack them on the ground. In many of these scenarios, we lose 10 aircraft on the ground for every one we lose in air combat.
Did the Games indicate numbers of casualties that could be lost?
We haven't calculated the specific number of personnel casualties, but you're into the tens of thousands. So it would be a real shock to the United States and a much higher set of losses than we've experienced in the last generation. And this would happen within 3 or 4 weeks, not stretched over 5 or 10 years.
Mark, how significant is Taiwan's military? I know that they're being supported by the United States, but what impact would they have on, what did you see in the Games as far as what they could do in a potential conflict?
Well, of course, the Taiwanese have quite a strong military, and they are improving it. Their ground forces are critical because that is their mechanism for holding the Chinese invasion to a beachhead and then eventually driving it off. Their air force is also helpful, although it comes under intense attack by the Chinese. Its surface navy is extremely vulnerable. And one of the recommendations we make is that the Taiwanese should invest more heavily in what are called asymmetric capabilities, things like anti-ship missiles and mines that would not be subject to Chinese attack.
Obviously, the Chinese have been conducting military exercises around Taiwan. What does that indicate to you about their strategy?
Well, there are 2 things we see. First is they're being extremely aggressive. This last round of exercises was more than we've seen in a long time. So that impresses on everyone that this is a real military threat. What we're also seeing is their use of missiles that have landed around Taiwan. And that emphasizes also their missile capabilities, which in our war games play very heavily and damage U.S. Air forces and ships very heavily.
Did you take Japan into consideration in the war games? How would they be involved at all?
Absolutely. Japan is a critical player. Our base assumption is that Japan would allow the U.S. to use its bases in Japan, places like Okinawa, but would not actively participate unless the Chinese attack their homeland. In most cases, the Chinese do that to get at the U.S. Air operations. That brings the Chinese the Japanese in. The use of their bases is critical. Their air forces are also very helpful, and their surface fleets can also be helpful, although they're also very vulnerable.
But the question is, how motivated would they be to become involved in something like that, or would they stand back and say, this isn't my fight?
Well, our assumption is that initially they would do that. Inertia would probably rule, and they'd let the U.S. operate out of its bases, but they wouldn't be involved. But if the Chinese attack their homeland, if the Chinese have launched hundreds of missiles against their air bases, for example, we believe that would bring the Japanese in.
All right, so what's the best way to avoid conflict with China? I know it's a big question.
Well, the best way is to have a strong deterrent. And there are several ways we can enhance that deterrent. We recommend, for example, buying a lot more long-range anti-ship missiles so that we don't have to push forces forward. Buying and maintaining the bomber force, for example, is very helpful also.
All right. Well, Mark, nice to see you. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.